What is up everyone, Team Nato here, welcoming you back to another video. It's not much, but it's mine. Tonight we'll be talking about whether or not the Sony A7 III is still a viable option in 2021. The Sony A7 III has been out since 2018, and on the year that it was released, it was one of the best-selling cameras, outselling both Canon and Nikon in camera sales. Wow. Now fast forward 3 years later, is the A7 III still worth it? Is it still the beast that it once was? Can it still compete with its contemporaries that are released earlier this year and late last year? But before we move on, I would like to urge everyone to please hit the subscribe button, as it would make things run a bit smoother around here. Find out whether or not the A7 III is still worth it to buy in 2021. Let's look at the most recent camera releases that more or less belong in the same tier as the A7 III. Now the reason why I say the same tier as this A7 III, because there are a lot of cameras that are just too wild that were released last year and this year. So there was the A7S III, there is the Canon R5 and the Canon the Sony A9 Mark II, Sony Alpha 1, and this is just a nice bunch of cameras, but it's not in the same tier and in the same group as the A7 III. For this particular video, we will be looking at 3 newer cameras to compare with the A7 III. First is the A7C, which is like the smaller version of this one. Next is the Canon R6. And the next one is the Nikon Z6 Mark II. For the comparison, I'm gonna try to make it as short as possible. Nothing too technical, just on paper specs, because honestly I don't have any experiences with using other cameras like the EOS R6, the Sony A7C, and the Nikon Z6 II. But I'm gonna keep it like on specs versus specs, and let's check it out. Let's see how the A7 III stacks up against these newer cameras. First up is the Sony A7C, which is directly related to the A7 III. It's like a smaller version of the A7 III. It was released back in September 2020, so a full 2 years after the A7 III was released. The A7C and the A7 III both share the same 35mm full frame Exmor R sensor. They both have 24.2 megapixels, which is I think the sweet spot for megapixelage. Same ISO numbers at 100 to 51,200, and both expandable to 50 to 204,800 ISO. Both have 693 phase detection, autofocus, and 425 contrast. Both cameras have eye tracking, both for humans and animals for photos. Both can shoot JPEG and uncompressed RAW. And for video, both cameras shoot at 4K up to 30 frames per second. Both have face tracking in 4K and eye tracking in 1080p. Both shoot up to 120 FPS at 1080p. It's basically the same camera. Next, moving on to the Canon R6, which I think is the best among these 4 cameras that I'm comparing right now. The A7 III, A7C, Canon R6, and the Nikon Z6 Mark II. R6 has a smaller megapixel count of 20.2 compared to the 24.2 on the A7 III, but as I've mentioned, that is the sweet spot for me, 18 to 30-ish. In terms of native ISO, the R6 is higher at 100 up to 102,400 compared to the 50 to 51,200 on the A7 III. But expanded, the R6 is at 100 up to 204,800 as compared to this. This goes down up to 50 to 204,800. So not much of a difference, nothing really. The R6 has 1,053 phase detection autofocus, and it dwarfs the 693 that comes with the A7 III. Both cameras have eye tracking, face tracking, and both shoot JPEG and RAW, but the R6 actually shoot in HEIF, which is high efficiency image file format. For the video, I think this is where the A7 III shows its age compared to the R6, because the R6 can shoot up to 4K 60 FPS. R6 has 422 10-bit internal recording. The A7 III only does 8-bit recording. both internally and externally. They both shoot 120 FPS at 1080p, but again, the bitrate of the R6 is at 10-bit 422, which is amazing. The R6 is better in terms of specs on paper at least, but you can see that the A7 III was actually ahead of its time. It was released 2 years ago, and some of the specs of the A7 III holds up to now in 2021. Let's move on to the Nikon Z6 Mark II, which was released on October 14, 2020. Both the A7 III and the Z6 II both sport a 35mm full-frame CMOS sensor. Actually, I think the sensor of the Nikon is made by Sony. The Z6 II has 24.5 megapixels, not too much of a difference compared to the 24.2 megapixels of the Sony A7 III. They both have the native ISO range at 100 to 51,200, and they are both expandable up to 50 to 204,800. But this is where I think the Nikon might lose, because it only has 273 phase detection autofocus points compared to the 693 of the Sony A7 III, which is 2 years older than the Nikon Z6 II. Again, both cameras have eye detection, face tracking. Both cameras shoot JPEG and RAW. But for video, both cameras, it's basically the same on paper. Both shoot internally 8-bit, but the Z6 II can shoot up to 10-bit externally. Both cameras shoot 4K up to 30 FPS and 120 FPS in full HD. So it's pretty much the same specs across the board between these four cameras. I think the real outlier here is the R6. It's a beast of a camera for the price point. Speaking of price point, let's talk about the prices of these cameras. The most expensive one, of course, is the Canon R6, coming in at $3,600 with this 24 to 70 f4L lens. Yes, it includes the L lens at $3,600. So I think that's a pretty good price point given the beast that you're getting and the nice lens that comes with it. Next is the Z6 II, which is priced at $2,600 with again the 24 to 70 f4 lens. The A7 III is in third place. Again, I know it's 2 years old, but it's still pretty expensive. It still stacks up in terms of paper-to-paper specs, and it's priced at $2,198 with a 28 to 70 kit lens. Cheapest option here is the Sony A7C at $2,098 with a 28 to 60 kit lens. I would advise everyone to take this with a grain of salt, because again, this is not a real world comparison. This is just specs versus specs. What you see on paper, the shooting experience may be different for everyone. You should check out other channels who have actually compared these cameras to gain more knowledge on the cameras if you're looking to buy your first full frame mirrorless camera. Now let's leave those specs behind, let's leave the comparisons behind, and I would like to talk about my personal experiences on the A7 III. I've had this camera for around 7 to 8 months now, and I've never been happier with a camera. I used to have the EOS R. I switched because of these reasons. You can see it right here. Click that link and watch why I switched from the Canon EOS R to the Sony A7 III. This camera is a wonderful camera. It doesn't show its age yet. It's 2 years old. I got this used actually for around $1,400. But you can get a brand new one still. You can get used one if you're looking for a new or for your first full frame mirrorless camera. I think this one or the A7C is a great option. I'm still able to create beautiful photos with this camera. I'm still able to take beautiful videos with this camera. I'm using this professionally as well for my client shoots, client videos, and it hasn't failed me yet. Again, it's not only about the camera, but to be able to expand your skills, expand your knowledge in photography. The gear somehow has to grow with you as well. So if you're looking to upgrade to your first full frame mirrorless camera, the A7 III is definitely still worth it in 2021. And take this with a grain of salt again, but please let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below, and please don't forget to hit that like button, smash the subscribe button, and punch that notification bell so you are notified every time I have a new video. Again, this is Timmy Hanato. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.